Bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Good afternoon, it's exactly 2 o'clock. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Police will meet a senior Conservative backbencher to discuss allegations of blackmail and of intimidation. William Wragg has accused Downing Street of bullying and claims Tory whips have threatened to remove public funds from the constituencies of MPs trying to oust the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He'll speak to a Met detective next week, which means police could potentially open an investigation. A Number 10 Downing Street spokesman says an inquiry will only be opened if there's evidence to support the claims.
What's happening is in itself quite alarming. I was elected in 1997 on an issue of integrity in public life. And I think the situation now is, if anything, worse than it was then. I think it is serious. And I also think that the Prime Minister is in an incredibly precarious situation, and I would expect more of those letters to be put in sometime next week.
Unvaccinated NHS workers are demonstrating against mandatory jabs. They're marching through central London. They'll also lay their uniforms on the ground in Trafalgar Square as a protest against government plans to sack staff who've not had their COVID vaccines by the 1st of April. Retired surgeon Dr. Tony Hinton told GB News he's worried about the future of NHS workers.
My fear is, though, is that these NHS staff that have worked so hard and put themselves at risk initially are now so fed up with the way that they've been treated, is that even when this mandate is rescinded, I fear many will leave anyway.
The UK is taking steps to ease tensions between Russia and Ukraine. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace will head to Moscow to speak to his Russian counterpart after the UK's invitation to discuss security was accepted. It comes after Downing Street warned Russia would be punished if the country pushes ahead with any destabilising action. Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Tom Huggett told GB News by sending weapons to Ukraine, the UK is helping the country to defend itself.
Because I hope it will persuade Putin that this is a really daft idea. Because whatever he manages to do in the initial punch, and he's got the armour, he's got the men to invade, there's no question about that. But the occupation would be extremely difficult, as the Ukrainians would fight for their own country. So I hope very much what we're doing is we're dissuading Russia so that Putin doesn't make this daft decision.
Tom Tugendhat speaking there. Now, US police say a British astrophysicist who was fatally shot in Georgia was killed by a stray bullet. Dr. Matthew Wilson, who was visiting family, was lying in bed when he was hit. The 31-year-old was found dead at 2 a.m. last Sunday. Police described the incident as a random act, saying his death appears to be the result of a gun's reckless discharge. The majority of Ireland's coronavirus restrictions have now been lifted. COVID passes are no longer to be required for entry into hospitality and entertainment venues, and live events can now return to full capacity. An 8 p.m. curfew on the hospitality sector has also been removed. The country's Taoiseach Micheál Martin says today's a good day in Ireland's COVID journey.
We've done this by having the confidence to be ourselves. As we face into our second century as a free democracy, and as we navigate this new phase of COVID, it is time to be ourselves again.
Meanwhile, Irish police are investigating reports that a dead man was taken into a post office in an attempt to claim his pension. The incident allegedly happened in County Carlow. It's claimed his body was abandoned when a staff member asked about his well-being. The local mayor says the community is in shock. Police confirmed they're investigating the unexplained death of an elderly man. High street pharmacists will now be able to refer obese people to a free online NHS weight loss programme. Previously, obese patients in England had to see their GP before they can access the 12-week plan. Those with either high blood pressure, diabetes or BMI over 30 are being encouraged to speak to their pharmacists. A new survey suggests that 1 in 3 drivers are unaware of changes to road rules. 33% of motorists said they didn't know the highway code is being revamped, and that includes 4% who have no intention of looking at the details. The revised code of conduct, which is designed to protect cyclists and pedestrians, comes into force next week. Olympic cycling gold medalist Chris Boardman is to head up a new government agency called Active Travel England. It will be tasked with improving cycling and walking infrastructure across the country. The agency, which launched today, will manage the national active travel budget. TV, online, DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking mostly dry, although there will be some patchy rain across western and northern Scotland. Let's take a look at the details. Zooming into the southwest, and although it will be dry, there will be a good deal of cloud around this afternoon. Best of the brightness will be across Dorset and Somerset. Moving east towards the southeast England and East Anglia, again it will be dry, but with plenty of cloud around. The cloud will thin, especially across East Anglia. There could be the odd spot of drizzle across northwest Wales. Otherwise, the rest of Wales and the Midlands will be dry with a few sunny spells. Northwest England will also be rather cloudy today, with the best of any sunshine across Cumbria and Lancashire. Most will be dry, but some drizzle is possible perhaps across the Pennines. Temperatures will reach 8 degrees Celsius. Moving across the Pennines, and it should be much brighter across northeast England, with more in the way of sunshine. In the sunshine and light winds, temperatures will reach 10 degrees Celsius. Into Scotland, and for many it will be cloudy with some rain, especially in the north and west. It will be breezy across northern areas, but milder with highs of 11 Celsius. Northern Ireland will see a mix of cloud and sunny spells, with perhaps the odd spot of drizzle across the higher ground. Highs here will reach 9 or 10 Celsius. Heading into this evening, and we see little change, with the rather cloudy but largely dry weather continuing, and that is the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
What another interesting, fascinating, dramatic day in British politics. Boris Johnson in a pretty bullish mood at Prime Minister's Question Time today, in an attempt, a very deliberate attempt to change strategy. No apologies today, rather a continued drumming of what the government have achieved over the last the success of what the government have achieved over the last couple of years. But we saw a defection, and of course we saw David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, essentially lay into the Prime Minister, saying that now was the time to go. And all this, of course, while speculation continues about just how many letters have now been submitted to the 1922 committee to Sir Graham Brady, and whether that number will be reached. Has the Prime Minister potentially, has even that defection bought Boris Johnson a little bit more time? We're not now expecting, we think, that report from Sue Gray, the senior civil servant investigating claims of parties in Downing Street, until next week. We're going to bring you the highlights from what happened at PMQs in just a couple of minutes. As always, get in touch, gbviews at gbnews.uk. Very keen to hear what you've got to say, but delighted to say that joining me now outside Parliament to get their insight is Chris Hope from The Telegraph and Dan Hodges from The Mail on Sunday. Very good afternoon to both of you, gentlemen. Chris, let's start with you. Just your assessment of Prime Minister's Question Time. It was quite messy, wasn't it? Keir Starmer didn't kind of land as many punches as people may have thought, or he's done in the past. But what was your thoughts?
He looked comfortable, I thought, Keir Starmer. He's invited other MPs to join him from across the divide. I thought, I think this kind of news from Christian Wakeford today, which did certainly shock Parliament, is only going to unite the Tory party more with Boris Johnson. I think it has bought him some more time. The Sue Gray report's out next week. David Davis is, in the name of God, go jive to Boris Johnson. Really knocked the wind out of him him. You almost see him being winded physically at the dispatch box. I mean, no one was expecting that at all. So now DD's back in the game as a kind of kingmaker if Boris Johnson goes somewhere. I personally think that if there's no confidence vote, it could be an opportunity to reset the whole administration. I think Boris Johnson needs a wake-up call to get a grip both on his party, his MPs, and number 10, because currently he hasn't got it.
Lots to unpick there. Dan, first of all, on the defection, I take Chris's point. Your politics might play as it does here, that it might unite the Tory party, but a defection is still a sign of weakness, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Chris is right. I mean, I think, you know, we were looking at a situation where it was conceivable we would have had all the letters in by 5 p.m. today. One sort of rebel told me, but I think the Wakeford defection, as Chris said, has set that back at least until next week. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, we've got to understand what happened today. I mean, a Tory MP, a sitting Tory MP in a relatively marginal seat, just sort of came across to Keir Starmer's Labour Party. Now, obviously, that would have been unthinkable under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership.
Maybe unthinkable 6 months ago.
Oh, 6 months ago, indeed. And you know, a lot of the people are fanning out, you know, attacking Wakeford, calling him ambitious, you know, he's looking after himself. Well, that's the problem. That's the political problem for Boris now, because somebody who is ambitious, clearly like Christian Wakeford is, thinks his political fortunes are best served by serving under Keir Starmer than under Boris Johnson. And I think that tells you about a lot about the strategic problem that Boris now faces, and more broadly the Conservative Party faces.
And indeed, we had a poll out today suggesting supporting that red wall, the so-called red wall, has slumped potentially, that the Conservatives only hold on to 3 out of the 45 seats there. How much is that playing on the MPs that you talked about?
This isn't just a red wall situation. The 2019 intake comes from across the country, facing Lib Dems, Labour, and regionally everywhere, and that's what has been forgotten, I think, in all this. The whips, I think, were quite blindsided by this. I think did they make it worse? Arguably, some of the bully boy tactics of the whips have made it worse. Certainly, I gather Wakeford was threatened with losing his seat at the next election. It may be a threat to it under the boundary changes due in July 2023. So I think it hasn't helped. I think some of these MPs, let's not feel too sorry for them, because they're paid and pay good wages to do what they do, but they haven't really had a good time of the lockdown. They've become MPs, many not expecting to become MPs because of the red wall victories, and no one's really said to them, here's how you do the job. They've really been dropped into it, and they're trying to work out who their friends are, and that's why they've kind of coalesced around, is Boris Johnson the answer? The warning for the Tories is they are rubbish in opposition. They hate it. They want to be in power. Labour's more suited to opposition because they like discussing ideas and ranting about debates, but I think that's what I would say. The concern for Tories is don't get into opposition if you're them.
In saying that, we had Anne Whitcomb on this morning talking about how the Conservative Party was a rabble and they were idiots, the people submitting letters. Was it, or is it even still, not necessarily a great move to submit those letters before Sue Gray has reported? Because you could have a leadership challenge to a Prime Minister where, frankly, there is no official report into what may well have happened.
I think what you're seeing, I think it's just a reflection of what Tory MPs are now getting in their post bags and getting on the doorsteps. I mean, we went away last weekend and we thought, well, we'll just have to wait for the Sue Gray report and see how this plays out. But what we saw quite clearly is MPs went away over the weekend, and they were some of them were quite frankly shocked about the scale of the reaction. You mentioned the red wall poll. Remember, we had a poll in the Mail on Sunday 2 or 3 weeks ago which showed a collapse in red wall seats. That predated what we've just seen. And I think the key thing from today is I think Boris has bought himself a little bit more time. But you touched on the David Davis intervention as well. Now we've got a situation here where we see red wall MPs putting in letters. We've seen David Davis, one of the Tory grandees, one of the architects of Brexit. He stood up and asked for the Prime Minister to go. The Spartans are on manoeuvres. It's the breadth of opposition that Boris is now facing. Under Theresa May, it was quite binary. It was Brexiteers against Remainers. This is across the breadth of the Conservative Party now, and I think that's the real problem for Boris.
I see memories of IDS 2003. It's the party MPs, they are unhappy with the leader. They may be going ahead of where the membership is, but they want to get somebody who's electable in next election 2020.
Just burning on this, Chris, but Boris Johnson's not IDS. He is the kind of political comeback kids, as in, he's come back from many political perceived crises in the past. And there's a lot of people out there who still quite like him. There's a lot of MPs who still quite like him. They quite liked his kind of more bullish approach today. I think you've got a sense of that in the chamber. I mean, is there a pathway through for him here?
Well, there is, but why has he been hiding? Why is it that we only ever see him on GBNews and other stations when he's being snapped or grabbed at a hospital or school, and it's like he's being hunted and they've found him, quickly interview him for 10 minutes, then he disappears again? Why not let Boris be Boris? You know, why can't he go out there and start doing Q&As with weekly Q&As with members and take the questions, take the hits? Cameron did it, you know, ask questions to Dave, went down really well, and I think that might be an idea they might be looking to do once they get past, well, maybe they're past this drama before the next one.
Well, we'll see. OK, gentlemen, we're going to pause there for the time being. Let's bring you some of the highlights from Prime Minister's Question Time. A hell of a lot going on. Enjoy. This is some of the best bits from PMQs a little earlier.
Can I start by warmly welcoming the honourable member for Bury South to his new place and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves, whereas the Labour Party stands ready to provide an alternative government that the country can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has changed, and so has the Conservative Party. He and anyone else who wants to build a new Britain built on decency, security, prosperity and respect is welcome in my Labour Party. Every week, the Prime Minister offers absurd and frankly unbelievable defences to the Downing Street parties, and each week it unravels.
I've been elected the chair. I don't need to be told how to conduct the business. So if somebody wants to do some direction, I'll start directing them out of the chamber. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I see the very noise. I'm sure the Chief Whip has told them to bring their own booze.
Order. Let's try and get on with questions. It's going to be a long day, if not. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, first he said there were no parties. Then the video landed, blowing that defence out the water. Next he said he was sicker than furious when he found out about the parties, until it turned out that he himself was at the Downing Street garden party. Then last week he said he didn't realise he was at a party, and surprise, surprise, no one believed him. So this week he's got a new defence. Nobody warned me that it was against the rules. That's it. Nobody told him. Since the Prime Minister wrote the walls, why on earth does he think that his new defence is going to work for him?
Of course, Mr. Speaker, we must wait for the outcome of the inquiry. But I renew what I've said, Mr. Speaker. But when it comes to his view,
nobody believes what you say. Can we have a little less? I want to this Prime Minister like I wanted to leader of the opposition. I want the same courtesy from both sides. Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, if we'd listened to the right honourable gentleman about COVID restrictions, which is the substance of his question, then, Mr. Speaker, we would still be we would have been in lockdown after July. If this is the truth, if we listened to the Labour front bench in the run-up to Christmas and New Year, Mr. Speaker, we would have stayed in restrictions with huge damage to the economy. And it's because of the judgments that I've taken and that we have taken in Downing Street that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and GDP, Mr. Speaker, now back up above pre-pandemic levels. And as for Bury South, Mr. Speaker, as for Bury South, let me say to the right gentleman, Mr. Speaker, by all leave, may I say to the right honourable gentleman that the Conservative Party won Bury South for the first time in generations under this Prime Minister, with an agenda of uniting and levelling up and delivering for the people of Bury South. And, Mr. Speaker, we will win again in Bury South at the next election.
Not only did he write the rules, but some of his staff say they did warn him about attending the party on the 20th of May 2020. Now, I've heard the Prime Minister's very carefully crafted response to that accusation. It almost sounds like a lawyer wrote it. So I'll be equally careful with my question. When did the Prime Minister first become aware that any of his staff had concerns about the 20th of May party?
Speaker, it is for the inquiry to come forward with an explanation of what happened, and I'm afraid he simply must wait. But he asks about my staff, Mr. Speaker. He asks about my staff and what my staff are doing and what they have told me. And I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that they have taken decisions throughout this pandemic that he has opposed to open up in July, Mr. Speaker, as I have said, to mount the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, and Mr. Speaker, to double the speed of the booster rollout, with the result that we have the most open economy in Europe, Mr. Speaker.
Extraordinary with each version of his defence. If the Prime Minister's new defence were true, it requires him to suggest that his staff are not being truthful when they say they warned him about the party. It requires the Prime Minister to expect us to believe that whilst every other person who was invited on the 20th of May to the party was told it was a social occasion, he alone was told it was a work meeting. It also requires the Prime Minister to ask us to accept that as he waded through the empty bottles and platters of sandwiches, he didn't realise it was a party. Does the Prime Minister realise how ridiculous that sounds?
Mr. Speaker, I've said what I've said about the events in Number 10. He will have to wait for the. He'll have to wait for the. And Mr. Speaker, I think he asks for further clarification. I think there are lots of people who are interested. I say this entirely in passing, Mr. Speaker. Lots of people are interested in the exact legal justification from the learned leader of the opposition for the picture of him drinking a pint of beer.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Let's kick off with former Chief Advisor to the Prime Minister Dominic Cummings, who's accused Boris Johnson of lying to Parliament about that event on the 20th of May 2020 in the Downing Street Garden. Cummings says he's prepared to swear an oath that he warned the Prime Minister not to go ahead with the gathering and that he needed to get a grip of the madhouse. Well, in an exclusive poll for GBNews, we've found that over 2/3 of you believe that Mr Johnson has not told the truth about those parties in Downing Street. Meanwhile, an enormous 83% of Brits believe he clearly has broken the government's own lockdown rules. And one other interesting point here is that 44% of Brits now feel no obligation to follow further restrictions if they were introduced in light of those stories. But what are the political consequences of this? Well, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio now by Shadow Peace and Disarmament Minister, the Labour MP Fabian Hamilton. Welcome to the programme. First of all, we've been hearing a lot about the Prime Minister trying to win back support of Conservative MPs, walking around the tea rooms. As your sense in Westminster, when you speak to Conservatives as well as those on all sides of the House, does it seem like the Prime Minister is panicking?
Yes, in short. They supported him because they saw him as a vote winner, and he proved that at the 2019 general election. But since then, the very personality traits that made him so adorable to the Conservative masses, as it were, are the very things that have proved his undoing. And the fact that he's prepared to defy convention, prepared to break the rules, prepared to change things in a radical way, are now coming back to haunt him. So many Tory MPs that I speak to when I'm in the House are really, really upset. But they're saying, hold fire, because we're going to deal with this.
Now, your leader tries to present himself as almost the anti-Boris, the opposite of Boris in every sort of way. Some might say too boring, some might say not exciting enough, but clearly that's the position that Sir Keir Starmer is trying to paint himself in.
Yes.
Is he somewhat undermined by that, with that famous photo now of during April 2021, having a beer with colleagues, that same month that the Queen sat alone for Prince Philip's funeral?
Tom, if you're suggesting for 1 minute that having a beer at lunchtime whilst you're out canvassing in a by-election at the office of a local MP is comparable in any way to the Prime Minister organising these parties, lying to Parliament, denying that he'd ever knew anything about it, and then being discovered that actually he did know about it all the time, and that there were many more parties. This was not a party. Keir Starmer was having a break for lunch whilst working in a constituency. He was not breaking any rules. That's the important thing here. So this is a complete and utter distraction from a man who has debased the office of Prime Minister and brought all politicians into disrepute, I would say.
I think a lot of people across the country would think that having a beer at work isn't a particularly bad thing to do. It doesn't seem like an egregious breach. It seems like probably, even if it is ambiguous with regard to the rules, many people have been ambiguous with regard to the rules over the last 2 years. They've been very complicated, very difficult to follow in many senses. But it does sort of raise the question of, is having a beer at work OK? Is that work? And many people would say yes.
Well, are we saying that having a beer at work is the same as organising parties with tables laid out with wine and cheese, with all the rules at the time? And this was a year before the photo of Keir Starmer, when the rules were much, much stricter. Are we saying that that is comparable in any way to having a beer after work with one other person, or at lunchtime while you're having a sandwich and you're out knocking on doors? I don't think there's any comparison. It's a distraction to take the media's interest away from this scandal that has completely engulfed the Conservative Party and the current Prime Minister. And it's appalling, frankly.
Now, just from a political point of view, the Labour Party is calling for the Prime Minister to resign. Is that the wisest thing to do in the world if, in short order, a different Conservative Party leader were to take over? The party would yet again reinvent itself for the 4th time in the space of 10 years and potentially then usurp your party again in the polls. Is this a wise political strategy?
I think it's best for the country. That's the point. It may not be best for the Labour Party. But the fact is that this is about modern conservatism. If the Conservatives think that just simply by replacing Boris, who frankly no longer has a right to be Prime Minister, given all the breaches and the laws that he's broken, and the lies that he's told the House of Commons, if they think that just replacing him with somebody else is somehow going to mend the fences with the British public and the electorate, they're entirely wrong. Personally, I'd rather he saw out his term to a general election and the British public pronounce their verdict through the ballot box. That would be much, much more democratic than a cabal of conservative associations deciding who they wanted to succeed him.
Now, what a lot of people are irritated about in this entire saga, in this entire story, is that some other real issues, not only in the UK, but in the world, are being missed. Now, you're Shadow Peace and Disarmament Minister, and Russia is behaving incredibly belligerently now, and we're thinking that there may well be an invasion of Ukraine in the next weeks or months. What's your view on that?
Well, my view on this is that we need to do what the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and the Shadow Defence Secretary John Healey said in the Commons yesterday at the statement on Ukraine, which is actually try and bring the Russians and the Ukrainians around the table. It's not good enough for Russia to talk to the United States. NATO needs to be involved. NATO is a defensive alliance. It is not an aggressive alliance. And the Ukrainian people deserve better, frankly. They've endured the most appalling civil war. They've endured the secession of Donbass under Russian occupation, part of their nation state. Many Ukrainians have died trying to defend their country. They deserve a lot better. But the way to do this is not through military force. It is actually through negotiation, through steps towards peace, through discussion, through actual, looking at the issues and trying to stop any potential violence or invasion. Because make no mistake, the Ukrainians will defend their country. And the loss of lives both on the Ukrainian side and I would say on the Russian side would be enormous. And that is not a price worth paying. Every conflict that's ever happened in human history has ended with negotiations around the table. Well, let's cut the conflict out. Let's talk to one another in a civilized manner and try and understand what the issues are and how we can resolve them. That's how we attain a more peaceful society and a more peaceful world.
Well, I wish we could talk for longer on this very, very important issue. I'm afraid we've run out of time in this interview.
What a shame.
Fabian Hamilton, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing on GB News.
The Prime Minister has denied, essentially, those latest attacks from Dominic Cummings. He's mounted a full-scale rescue plan to try and bolster his job, his career, to try and save his position after the allegations we've seen, the drip feed of allegations over the last couple of weeks. Well, we can now discuss this with the news editor at Conservative Home, Henry Hill, who joins us down the line. Henry, very good afternoon to you. I suppose the first question is, what did you make of Boris Johnson's interview a little bit earlier?
I mean, the government's holding position is essentially to hope that they can weather the Sue Gray report and that there will not be sufficient momentum amongst Conservative MPs to get rid of him immediately, and that will buy him the space to recover. But the lines being offered by the Prime Minister are extraordinarily thin. You know, this most recent one is that he will resign if he misled Parliament, but only if he knowingly misled Parliament. Well, you know, the definition of the word knowingly is that he will already know whether he did that. That's not something that Sue Gray's report can tell us. So it really is remarkable to see the Prime Minister's defence effectively being that he simply had no idea what was going on, which is in itself not a great position to be in as Prime Minister. And there's also an obvious tension between the phrase, I take full responsibility for what happened, and other people are going to pay the price for what happened. And yet, you know, if you read about Operation Save Big Dog or whatever they're calling it, it does seem to be that dismissing other members of the Downing Street operation is central to his plan to save his job.
This afternoon, there's some lobby hacks in Westminster, some reporters there suggesting that there's been a meeting of MPs from the 2019 intake who may well be putting letters in to the 1922 committee. Have you heard anything along those lines, or what's your sense of where Conservative MPs are at in all of this?
So yeah, I've seen those reports as well. It wouldn't surprise me. I've not spoken to any MPs from the 29 intake specifically, but broadly speaking, I think the thing that's most concerning for Conservative MPs, they're caught in a vice, really, because on the one hand, not only is this story very bad and it's kind of destroyed Boris Johnson's personal ratings and thus the government's ratings, and the whole reason he was Prime Minister is because he had that unique ability to connect to the electorate. But also, we simply have no idea when this story is going to stop. They hoped that it would be done over Christmas and that the government could start pivoting back onto its agenda in January. Now we're sort of coming up to 2/3 of the way through January. We're still neck deep in this story. We don't know when the next email, photograph, whatever, is going to come out. So that's deeply problematic. But the other side of the vice, if you like, for Conservative MPs is simply the fact that this is a very, very bad time to have a Conservative leadership contest, because the mechanics and the procedure for that are quite drawn out. And the last thing you want if you're about to sail into a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, is to have your Chancellor and other senior members of the government off stumping to Conservative associations when they should be focusing on the day job. I think the reason that people were originally talking about waiting until after the local elections is not just because they would be a good test of the Prime Minister's popularity, but also simply because summer is the best time to have a contest. So they're in a really tricky spot at the moment.
In saying that, aside from what MPs think, what do your members or Conservative supporters, I should say, think about this? There was a poll out last night, effectively saying lots of them didn't believe Boris Johnson on this, but they still wanted him to be Prime Minister. And there is a section of the public out there, maybe quite a large section of the public, who think that we should be focusing on other things in the media. They're bored to death about hearing about this subject, and they still want Boris Johnson to continue on, almost irrespective of what has happened in Number 10 over the last 18 months to 2 years.
So there's conflicting evidence on this. There is one poll that did find a majority of Conservative members want the Prime Minister to stay on, at least for now. Conservative Home's own survey, we did a snap survey of our own panel of party members earlier this month, and we found that even though we phrased it quite stringently, we said, the question was, do you think the Prime Minister should resign right now? We found a majority of respondents who've previously given the Prime Minister sort of 90+% approval ratings. A majority of them wanted him to go.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
And I'm delighted to say that Michael Fabricant joins me in the studio now. Welcome to the programme. Now, a lot of people won't understand exactly the structure of how Downing Street operates at the moment. Could you run through what the problem is with this whole Cabinet Office situation and why a separate office of the Prime Minister might be better?
Yes, I mean, a lot of these news stories coming out about drinking parties are actually nothing to do with the political team or Prime Minister. It now turns out that it was civil servants drinking, and we know that, for example, on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral, one of them was a going-away party, and, at the time, Boris was 40 miles away in Chequers, and the Prime Minister wouldn't have known about it because it was at a sort of junior level within the civil service. Now, the problem is this. For years and years and years, the people who work in Downing Street, the civil servants, are part of the Cabinet Office. And the Cabinet Office is some way away in Whitehall. And all the senior management are in Whitehall, which is a separate building. And I can tell you that if you have a pass to go to the Cabinet Office, it doesn't get you into Downing Street, let alone into the building. So what I'm arguing for is an idea that actually Tony Blair came up with and failed. And what Tony Blair's idea was that there should be an Office of Prime Minister, as you said. And why would that make a difference? It would mean that the senior civil servant management team would actually be based in Downing Street, because Downing Street, in a way, operates almost as a separate fiefdom, independent of the Cabinet Office, even though all the civil servants, and I think the special advisors too, are all paid for and report to rules for the Cabinet Office in a separate building. So it needs tighter controls, because it's quite clear that both in Downing Street and maybe in the civil service as a whole, and frankly, listening to what you were saying earlier on, I suspect businesses too, you know, had their own interpretation of what the rules should be.
So it's your argument here that the Prime Minister doesn't have enough control over the operation of the civil service, particularly when it comes to doing Downing Street business?
I would go further and say that the civil service itself doesn't have enough control over what goes on in Downing Street, because it is a separate building, because there isn't easy connections between the Cabinet Office. There is actually a secret tunnel, which I've been through, but you pass an armed guard and you have to have a very special pass to do it. But for all intents and purposes, it's a completely separate building. And the whole thing is becoming conflated now with what Boris Johnson attended, that garden party, which we all so famously know about, and other parties that were going on, which the opposition quite naturally are dancing up and down with glee about, suggesting that these all were attended by Boris Johnson, when in fact it's quite clear that, as I say, junior civil servant events, why would he know? In fact, I did a radio programme yesterday, and the interviewer, who claimed to have been working in Downing Street before in the Labour Party, was saying, oh, well, you know, Gordon Brown would have known about it and come running down from his flat. What utter nonsense, because the flat is above number 11. It's on the 5th and 6th floors of the building. Most of these parties, if they were going on, and some of them were going on, we know that, would have been on the 1st and 2nd floors.
Or indeed the basement, as one of those was.
Yes, indeed.
But I suppose, of course, you'd expect the Labour Party to conflate every different sort of party. You'd expect that...
we would have done the same in the circumstances. It's politics.
But that doesn't change the fact that there were some of those events that the Prime Minister himself did attend, particularly those ones in the garden. Now, epidemiologically, we might say that that's clearly a lot safer than sitting in a stuffy office with someone.
Or indeed in someone's kitchen, as Keir Starmer did, because...
But of course, the rules weren't all that logical at many points. And many people who are very frustrated with the fact that the rules seemed to be so illogical, well, if the Prime Minister could not follow them, why couldn't everyone else? Would it be your view as a Conservative MP that some of those people that got fines during those period should be reimbursed?
Well, that's an interesting one. I've never thought of. That's a judicial question. What I would say, and do agree with you, is that not only did people interpret the rules, I don't think they understood the rules. And the problem was because the epidemic was constantly changing, so the rules had to constantly change. But they were, in times, illogical, as you say. So I don't think it was just that people didn't care to stick to the rules. I don't think they understood them.
Do you think the Prime Minister understood them?
Oh, I don't know. How can I say? I mean, how can I get in? Nobody can get in Boris's mind. Quite frightening to even think about it. But, you know, also listening to your monologue earlier on, I always say monologue, although it's a good broadcasting term, sounds rude, actually. But listening to what you had to say earlier on, and there could be changes coming. I mean, I was reading that because of the way we've handled COVID, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine are now saying that England, possibly the UK, could be the first country in the Northern Hemisphere to actually leave the epidemic. We're already seeing the amount of numbers of people catching it going down in London, and it's plateaued in the West Midlands.
And if that happens and the restrictions go, potentially that's a new lease of life for Boris Johnson. It's an interesting question as to whether he would get any recognition for that. I'm afraid we've run out of time on this interview, but Michael Fabricant, thank you very much for your very interesting thoughts there.
Number 10 has launched a new policy drive to win over those voters and MPs who may well have lost trust after a series of lockdown party controversies. It comes as reports are emerging. The Prime Minister is set to drop Plan B COVID restrictions in the coming week. So what is more important to voters, policies or the COVID party controversies? Well, joining me now to talk about all this is the co-founder of Delta Poll, Joe Twyman. Joe, good afternoon to you. On that question, at the moment, the media seems very animated by the parties. Lots of the public do too. Where do you think the balance is between those who are angry about all of this and those, frankly, that think we should maybe be focusing on other things?
Well, the reality is that most people, the average person in the street and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street, actually doesn't pay much attention to the cut and thrust of politics, to the individual specific details. Instead, what they're interested in are the broad narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves and each other about the parties. Whether a party can be trusted, whether a party plays by its own rules, whether a party acts fairly, whether a party acts competently. And all of these narratives are informed by lots of different things. The leaders, the policies, and indeed the news and events surrounding a party. Most recently, we've seen a series of bad news stories for the government, going right the way back to before Owen Paterson, though really he could be seen as the start of the most recent bad series of stories. And most recently, we've seen the issue around parties when it was the day before the funeral of Prince Philip. Now, all of those have helped to enforce a narrative in the mind of many people that the government really aren't playing by its own rules and cannot be trusted. And we're seeing that that's leading to a damaging position for the Conservatives in the polls. Now, many of your viewers may say, oh, well, but how long will that last? And that's a good question. We don't know. But certainly up until now, it's been a difficult thing for them to shake off. And as each news story emerges, it's difficult for them to move the news agenda on.
Is this one of these issues, Joe, that essentially could change the overall narrative? There were events on there that happened that bump around in the polls, and then there were kind of significant moments that change real thought processes. Is your sense that it's difficult to judge sometimes in the heat of stories whether this will play on voters' minds, not just in May of this year, but potentially in elections in years to come?
Exactly. It's very easy to point to something and say, oh, this was extremely important, and look at how influential it was. But in polling, what we're interested in is the distinction between turning points and talking points. Now, if we go back to previous talking points, for instance, Dominic Cummings and Barnard Castle and the talk in the Rose Garden of Downing Street, if that hadn't happened, would the polling where we are now be significantly different? Probably not. We'd probably be exactly where we are. And that attracted a lot of attention at the time, and many column inches and many hours of debate on TV and radio. But it didn't actually seem to change the needle significantly. Could this, however, be different? Well, it could be, but as I say, it's too early to tell. In the artificial construct of a survey instrument, we ask respondents, if there were a general election tomorrow, which party would you vote for? But there isn't a general election tomorrow, and people taking part know that. Instead, there are local elections in May. This could have a big impact then. But the general election is potentially years away still. And so will people get into the voting booth in 2023 or 2024 and say, I'm not going to vote Conservative because they had a party before Prince Philip's funeral? Well, some people might say that, but the number is probably likely to be very, very small. Instead, a far greater number may well go into the voting booth and say, I'm not going to vote Conservative because I don't trust them and I don't think they play by the rules. That's a far more damaging situation to be in. But of course, that may fade away, and come the election, they may instead focus on anything from the cost of living to tax cuts that may or may not take place. We just don't know, and there's plenty of time remaining.
Indeed, but one of the things that will, I would have thought, play in is how people feel that the pandemic has been handled, given it has had a major impact on all of our lives. Anecdotally, at least, I get a sense that people feel that the government got the measures right, in England at least, over Christmas. Have we got any sense of polling around around how the government's handled COVID?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because throughout the pandemic, for nearly 2 years now, we've seen the popularity of the government generally and the Prime Minister specifically correlate very closely with whether the public believe the government has done a good job or a bad job in handling the pandemic. And up until recently, the perception was that the government, generally speaking, had done a good job in handling it, and had, for instance, as you said, probably made the right decision when it came to Christmas. There were still significant numbers of people who felt that the rules didn't go far enough and they were enacted too late, and a small number who believed they went too far. But generally speaking, a plurality of the public thought that they were doing the right thing. But in a sense, that has now all been sidetracked by the events around Partygate. And when people think of the government's handling of the pandemic, increasingly they're not thinking about things like lockdowns, or indeed things like the very popular vaccine program. Instead, they're thinking about parties from Downing Street officials at inopportune times that may or may not have broken laws and rules.
And Joe, just finally on the Labour Party, in terms of where they're at, clearly they've opened up this substantial lead. It is often difficult for opposition parties. Many say governments lose elections, oppositions don't necessarily win them. But there is this sense that, as unpopular as Boris Johnson is, that Keir Starmer hasn't really punched through with voters yet. There's not a great sense of love for the Labour leader yet.
In normal times, you would expect it to be difficult for an opposition to cut through in terms of their policies and their profiles and their personalities. But in the time of a coronavirus pandemic, it's extremely difficult. And so it's perhaps no surprise that Keir Starmer and his team have suffered such difficulties over the last 2 years, given the situation.
Now, as COVID-19 made its way into our life, so did transmission models. But was there an overemphasis on worst-case scenarios? In those models, Conservative MP Bob Seely will be leading a debate in the House of Commons today. And he joins me now. Very good to see you, Bob Seely. Really interested in the debate that you're leading in Parliament today, and we're really pleased that you're joining us. Forgive me if I start by asking, though, about former top aide Dominic Cummings saying that he warned the Prime Minister the number 10 party invite broke the rules. Claims the Prime Minister waved it aside and said he would swear his version of events under oath. The Prime Minister said it's not true. Who do you trust?
I trust the Prime Minister. And to be honest, the problem with this debate, look, I'm not saying that Partygate's clearly a bit of a mess and needs to be cleaned up, and the Prime Minister's apologised. Is it going to get one kid in school? No. Is it going to solve a war in Eastern Europe? No. Is it going to bring COVID restrictions to an end? No. Like most people in this place, I'm actually focused on stuff that I can help make a better Britain doing, getting people back in education, getting the businesses going again, and frankly, getting normal life happening again. This is going to be a really busy and important year, and this is a massive, massive distraction. And frankly, yeah, I'm not doubting that things should have been done differently. I'm not pretending otherwise, but really, there is a difference between stuff that is important in people's lives and stuff that isn't.
Thank you. Tell us about the parliamentary debate you're leading today.
Gloria, look, I speak in favour of science because science is really, really important. But because the lockdown modelling has had such an extraordinary impact on our lives, and not just now, but in foot and mouth as well, we need to be questioning it. Questioning it does not mean you're a lockdown skeptic. It does not mean you're against science. It does not mean you're a conspiracy theorist. But when you have modelling that says 5,000 deaths a day, and median case scenarios of 3,000 deaths a day, and we're not even running at a 10th or even a 20th or a 30th of that, then we need to be seriously looking at modelling because it has such a profound impact on our society. And the important thing in this debate, I'm not really going to be personally attacking the modelling. I'm going to be quoting increasingly scientists who have become increasingly uncomfortable with modelling, with the flaws in the modelling, but also how that modelling has been presented. And it's not just about modelling, it's about how that's used by public health officials and how that's used by politicians as well. So it's a complex picture.
Perhaps it's wrong to accuse the modellers of sort of exaggerating the threat. Perhaps it's the media. Perhaps the nature of exaggerate and simplify, which is sort of, we do in the media, takes the worst case scenarios, the most sensational headlines.
You're right. Sorry, Gloria, that was the one piece I left out. So it's about modelers. Modelers are getting it wrong some of the time anyway, and certainly their worst case scenarios, and even their median cases, the average case scenarios. But then it's how that's interpreted by the media, who are addicted to bad news, risk-averse public health officials, and frightened politicians who are also risk-averse. And it is almost the interplay of that. I'm going to be looking at the modelling because I'm going to be quoting a great deal from other scientists, and I try, depending on how much time I've got in the debate, I'm going to be quoting from up to 100 academics who've written peer-reviewed work and the stuff that they've written about the modelling. But there is, you're absolutely right, a more complex picture. It's about the way that modelling has been presented in the media, the way the government has said follow the science, when actually science was having this debate, and we followed bits of the science and maybe the bits that we shouldn't necessarily have been following. So it is much more complex than just saying the modelers didn't forecast precisely, therefore the modelers are at fault. There is a problem with the modelling, and I'm going to be quoting a lot of academics who try to explain why, but there's also a problem with how it's presented, how it's interpreted, the willingness of the media just to say worst case scenarios are the norm. But effectively, during the crisis, we took what the army would say is the worst case scenario, most dangerous course of action, when in fact we should have been looking at the most likely course of action. And I think that has driven a lot of mistakes.
The government make projections, or they ask experts to make projections in all sorts of things. It's not just COVID, like the Office of Budget Responsibility, like climate change. Of course, they can't be precise because you can't account for things like a pandemic on the public finances or on human behaviour and how that might affect climate change. It's tricky, isn't it?
It is really tricky, but we still have a right to question it. If we have the right to question the politicians and we have the right to criticise the media, and, you know, thank God for The Spectator, for GBNews, for The Telegraph, for the Daily Mail, because at least they've tried to keep a debate about this and try to question what government has been doing. And I wish more of the media had done that, frankly, including the BBC, which seemed to be, very sadly, the propaganda arm of the lockdown state, when actually it should have taken a more sceptical view about some of the claims. So this is a complex issue. But again, I restate, Gloria, I'm quoting from a lot of academics. I also think that we need a much bigger debate on this. I'm putting in at the end of this week for a 3-hour debate on the floor of the House, because there are many people who want to talk about this. And we can't forget the errors that have been made, but we also need to make sure that the government is planning ahead till next year, because later this year, because there will be another round of COVID come October, November, and we need to be looking at how to keep our society running when we have yet another iteration of COVID, which will sure as eggs be coming our way quite soon. And the way we do that is by taking things in our stride, by having a sense that the forecasting is accurate and balanced, and we're not just looking at worst case scenarios. But if you just look, if you just look at recent modelling to do with the potential rising cases now in January and February, and those predictions that were made in December, even the best case scenarios were highly dubious, and you know, the most likely scenarios were way out of line with what's actually happened.
Bob Seeley, a pleasure to talk to you, and that's quite an impressive shirt rack you've got behind you. Rack of shirts. Good to talk to you. Bob Seeley, the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight. Thank you.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking mostly dry, although there will be some patchy rain across western and northern Scotland. Let's take a look at the details. Zooming into the southwest, and although it will be dry, there will be a good deal of cloud around this afternoon. Best of the brightness will be across Dorset and Somerset. Moving east towards the southeast England and East Anglia, again it will be dry, but with plenty of cloud around. The cloud will then thin, especially across East Anglia. There could be the odd spot of drizzle across northwest Wales. Otherwise, the rest of Wales and the Midlands will be dry with a few sunny spells. Northwest England will also be rather cloudy today, with the best of any sunshine across Cumbria and Lancashire. Most will be dry, but some drizzle is possible perhaps across the Pennines. Temperatures will reach 8 degrees Celsius. Moving across the Pennines, and it should be much brighter across northeast England, with more in the way of sunshine. In the sunshine and light winds, temperatures will reach 10 degrees Celsius. Into Scotland, and for many it will be cloudy with some rain, especially in the north and west. It will be breezy across northern areas, but milder with highs of 11 Celsius. Northern Ireland will see a mix of cloud and sunny spells with perhaps the odd spot of drizzle across the higher ground. Highs here will reach 9 or 10 Celsius. Heading into this evening, and we see little change with the rather cloudy but largely dry weather continuing, and that is the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Good afternoon, it's just gone 3 o'clock. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB Newsroom. Police will meet a senior Conservative backbencher to discuss allegations of blackmail and intimidation. William Ragg has accused Downing Street of bullying and claims Tory whips have threatened to remove public funds from the constituencies of MPs trying to oust the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He'll speak to a Met detective next week, which means police could potentially open an investigation. A number 10 Downing Street spokesman says an inquiry will only be opened if there's evidence to support the claims.
What's happening is in itself quite alarming. I was elected in 1997 on an issue of integrity in public life. And I think the situation now is, if anything, worse than it was then. I think it is serious. And I also think that the Prime Minister is in an incredibly precarious situation. And I would expect more of those letters to be put in sometime next week.
Meanwhile, at a rally in Glasgow, there were calls for the Prime Minister to resign. The pro-independence organisation All Under One Banner staged a march with members demanding the end of Tory rule. Boris Johnson is facing increasing pressure to quit after admitting and apologising for going to a party at Downing Street during lockdown. Unvaccinated NHS workers are demonstrating against mandatory jabs. They've been marching through central London and gathering in Trafalgar Square. They lay their uniforms on the ground to protest against government plans to sack staff who've not had their COVID vaccines by the 1st of April. The UK is taking steps to ease tensions between Russia and Ukraine. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace will head to Moscow to speak to his Russian counterpart after the UK's invitation to discuss security was accepted. It comes after Downing Street warned Russia would be punished if the country pushes ahead with any destabilising action. Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Tom Tugendhat told GB News by sending weapons to Ukraine, the UK is helping the country to defend itself.
Because I hope it will persuade Putin that this is a really daft idea. Because whatever he manages to do in the initial punch, and he's got the armour, he's got the men to invade, there's no question about that. But the occupation would be extremely difficult, as the Ukrainians would fight for their own country. So I hope very much what we're doing is we're dissuading Russia so that Putin doesn't make this daft decision.
US police say a British astrophysicist who was fatally shot in Georgia was killed by a stray bullet. Dr. Matthew Wilson, who was visiting family, was lying in bed when he was hit. The 31-year-old was found dead at 2 a.m. last Sunday. Police described the incident as a random act, saying his death appears to be the result of a gun's reckless discharge. The majority of Ireland's coronavirus restrictions have now been lifted. COVID passes are no longer required for entry to hospitality and entertainment venues, and live events can return to full capacity. An 8 p.m. curfew on the hospitality sector has also been removed.
We've done this by having the confidence to be ourselves. As we face into our second century as a free democracy, and as we navigate this new phase of COVID, it is time to be ourselves again.
A new survey suggests that 1 in 3 drivers are unaware of changes to road rules. 33% of motorists said they didn't know the highway code is being revamped, including 4% who have no intention of looking at the details. TV, online and DAB plus radio, this is GB News. We'll have more news at the top of the next hour. Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking mostly dry, although there will be some patchy rain across western and northern Scotland. Let's take a look at the details. Zooming into the southwest, and although it will be dry, there will be a good deal of cloud around this afternoon. Best of the brightness will be across Dorset and Somerset. Moving east towards the southeast England and East Anglia, again it will be dry, but with plenty of cloud around. The cloud will then thin, especially across East Anglia. There could be the odd spot of drizzle across northwest Wales. Otherwise, the rest of Wales and the